So I'm going to be talking to you today about a project that I was blessed with when I started with Enbridge. This was the first project that I got when I started with them almost 4 years ago. There we go. And that's the Alberta Clipper Project. This presentation was developed by myself and former co-worker Poonam Madan, and it's based on a paper that we wrote and presented on at the Right-of-Way Conference in Halifax last fall. So I'll be talking about the Alberta Clipper Project. I'll give you some background on the post-construction environmental monitoring program. We'll talk about some examples with the process that we used when I first started working on this program. And some of the benefits we derived from employing that process, and at the end I'll of course provide some recommendations and some conclusions that we feel came out of that process at the end of the day as well. So the purpose of the Alberta Clipper Project was to move crude oil to Superior, Wisconsin. The total length of the Clipper Project was 1,607 kilometers, starting in Hardisty and ending in Superior, Wisconsin in the U.S. The total length of the Canadian side of the project was just over 1,000, well, it was 1,078 kilometers from Hardisty, Alberta to Gretna, Manitoba. The NEB issued a certificate of public need for the project. That was issued in May of 2008. Condition 19 on that certificate is the one that is of concern here today, and essentially it required Enbridge to report in January of each of the 5 years following the pipeline's operational date on a number of things. This included identifying on a map or a diagram the location of the project and any environmental issues which arose during construction. The report was required to discuss the effectiveness of the mitigation that was applied during construction and to assess whether or not it had been effective. And it was also talk about the current status of all the issues that were identified at the end of construction, including those that were raised at any point in time by landowners, and then to discuss whether or not those issues had been resolved, and if they were unresolved, to continue to report on our progress on those. In addition to that, of course, we had to provide our proposed mitigation measures for addressing the outstanding issues, timelines for resolving those issues, and generally basically tell them how the project was doing at the end of each of those 5 years. So 3 improvements were made during the project's post-construction environmental monitoring program, and I should point out that I actually got involved in this in 2012. I started with Enbridge in August of that year, and I sort of took over the post-construction environmental monitoring program by the end of that year. So there was a couple things that came up, and we identified the need to make some changes at that point in time if we were going to be successful in showing the NEB that we had actually completed a project and resolved all the outstanding issues with it. So one of the key issues for us was to actually be able to say that the issues that we were tracking in our monitoring program were actually issues that were related to construction. That was the NEB's issue. You'll remember those 3 things that they asked for. We had to be able to show them that we knew which issues were caused by construction and that we were actually working towards resolving them. What we actually had identified was that our list wasn't getting shorter every year. It was either at the same level or increasing, and that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, especially after a few years of post-construction monitoring. So we had to go and look at, well, how can we review all these issues? They can't all be construction-related issues. So we started with a desktop analysis, followed up by a field reconnaissance for every single issue that had been identified in the post-construction environmental monitoring program up to that point in time. And there were there was close to 700 of them at that point in time. And if it was construction related, then our intent was to keep it in our program and to report on it. If it was not, it was our intent and our hope that we would be able to take that out of the post-construction environmental monitoring program and reporting process and deal with it separately. So in order to be successful at the end of the day, we didn't want to know what was going to happen if we weren't successful. we had to be able to show the NEB, who is our project regulator, that we had identified all of the construction-related issues, we had applied the appropriate mitigations, and where those weren't working, that we had altered course and addressed those issues to their satisfaction. Otherwise, at the end of that 5 years, we weren't going to be successful, and I'm happy to say we didn't find out what would happen if we weren't successful, but this is the process that we used to actually get there. So I'm going to go on here and talk about that a little bit further. So what do we have to do in order to be able to assess whether or not the issue is related to construction or to some other non-construction related issue? We had to have a very good idea of what that right-of-way looked at prior to construction, first of all. And it might be a little bit easier these days to do that, but at the time that was a little more difficult than you might think. So our efforts went back to our pre-construction information, looking at the right-of-way assessments, some of which were specific enough and others weren't. We pulled all kinds of reports that predated construction as the project was being designed. We also went and pulled documents that were created during construction from environmental inspectors and post-construction, and reviewed all those resources for every single issue on the list. The as-built plans were also useful, but unfortunately they were always a snapshot in time that basically told you what you were looking at the time that the annual report was created. If there was some significant change over time, that might show up on those reports, but they weren't terribly useful. They were all hard copies, and so we really did have to go back and look at all this other documentation and spend a huge amount of time with staff going out and looking at every single one of those, like I mentioned, 680 plus issues on the right-of-way. When our people went out to the field to look at each of these sites, they were already provided with our information from our desktop analysis. And so at that point in time, we were able to tell them we think that this is or isn't a construction-related issue and why. And their job then was to go out and look at that, at each of those locations, and basically assess what factors they viewed on the ground at each location, and to look at that and say, well, yeah, we think this backs up your desktop analysis, or we don't. We think there are other factors here that may be contributing to the fact that this is still an environmental issue, whether it is or isn't related to your construction activity. That took us months. That started in late 2012, and it continued on into 2013. And at the end of the day, we essentially had two lists. One list of issues that we were fairly confident related to construction, and the other one that we were fairly confident was not. We just happened to luck out that we had a regulatory inspection of the project that fall, in late fall, from the NEB on the Clipper project. So even though we hadn't reviewed all of the issues at that point in time, we were able to walk the NEB through the process that we had used, show them the kind of records we had looked at, show them the results of our field reconnaissance as well, and discuss with them as to whether or not they felt that process was rigorous enough and that the conclusions we had drawn at that point in time were based on solid information. And we were also at that same time then testing out with them whether or not we had correctly interpreted what it was that the NEB was most interested in when they gave us that condition 19 on our certificate of public need, which asked us to report back on construction-related impacts of the project. And essentially what we were saying is, are there any issues if we report only on the environmental issues on this right-of-way that are related to construction and manage the non-construction related issues in another fashion that we would not have to report on annually? And we took them to a number of locations. Some of them are on some of the slides here that I'll share with you in a few moments. And at the end of the day, they basically said, yeah, we think that you've done an appropriate job. The focus is on mitigating the impact of your project. Yes, there will be environmental issues that predate the construction of your project, and there will be new ones that come up during the life of your project. Those aren't the ones that the NEB was wanting us to report on. So that actually was a huge help. It meant that we could continue with our efforts to go and visit the remaining sites where we had environmental issues and finish with that process to separate out the issues that were related to construction and those that weren't. I just mentioned too that, of course, when our staff were on site, I should suggest too that when they were out looking at a particular issue, that inspection wasn't related or specifically focused on just that right-of-way location. In many cases, the environmental inspector had to actually travel onto other adjacent lands following, for example, wetlands or water courses that traveled to that location from somewhere else. In many cases, we found weed issues that were on the right-of-way and they weren't somewhere else, not immediately adjacent to the right-of-way anyways. And that would suggest that if your right-of-way has an issue with weeds but the surrounding lands don't, then it's probably related to your construction. But we found in some cases, scentless chamomile being one of the more common culprits, that the weed had actually traveled down small ephemeral waterways from someone's farmyard somewhere else. And in one case, it was over 3 kilometers away from where we had the weed issue on a low point on our right-of-way. So fortunately, the environmental inspector saw a couple weeds on this little swale, followed it uphill, and found a yard full of scentless chamomile. It looked great in the photographs, but it wasn't our issue. And so that was one of the ones that we actually ended up taking off the list and putting somewhere else. In this example here, the assessment, the desktop assessment, identified the adjacent land and land use activities as the cause of the environmental issues rather than being construction related. The pre-construction wetland reports indicate that this was a healthy wetland prior to construction. These photos here show that the water levels in the wetlands were higher in 2008 than they were in 2010 at the time the middle photograph was taken, and that was right after the cleanup activities had been looked after. And I think I forgot to mention on the earlier slides that the project was, construction kicked off in 2008. Final reclamation following its in-service date was completed in 2010. So in 2010 we were still seeing there were some issues at this site. And we were looking at it in 2011 and 2012 in particular to try and figure out whether or not the mitigations that had been applied during construction were successful, whether or not we could amend them, or whether or not this was potentially a lost cause for us. The field reconnaissance that was conducted in 2012 actually confirmed that the wetland water levels had improved, but there had been a significant change in land use. The area had been cultivated, which impacted the quality of the wetland, and cattle were no longer restricted from getting into this area either. Early on, certainly prior to 2010, and definitely in 2008 and earlier, the water levels were high enough that cattle were just discouraged from using the area. But now all those things were combining to the extent that there was absolutely nothing we could do as part of our post-construction program to mitigate the impact of constructing the pipeline. So this was an example of one of the issues that we struck from our post-construction environmental monitoring list. In this example here, this is another change in land use scenario. This is another wetland or a creek crossing. So Clipper crossed a small creek in a cattle pasture. The 2010 environmental assessment information basically indicated that the site still had some issues, that additional mitigation was required to prevent erosion at the crossing and to facilitate revegetation of the crossing. Seemed pretty straightforward, but when we actually got out there in 2012, it was quite clear that cattle were the primary culprits here, and this pasture had probably not been used heavily by the landowner up until this point in time, but he was obviously happy with the reclamation on the right-of-way there and thought there was lots of good grass, especially along this swale, and thought that, okay, it's time to let the animals loose. And so in this particular case, there's nothing more that we could possibly do that would make any difference on this site. The landowner had clearly chosen to make other use of the property, and so this was another one that we had discussed with the NEB, and again they said, yeah, this isn't something that you guys can do anything about. So we were picking and choosing these in such a way that we could test with them various examples and our process and the outcomes that we were hoping to achieve. And fortunately, this was another one where they felt comfortable with what we're looking at. So actually, the approach allowed us to make a more accurate assessment of the issues. It allowed us to understand more effectively the impact of our construction and certainly the effectiveness of the mitigation measures. In many cases, the mitigations that had been planned during construction worked only up to an extent. If the climate in that particular area was wetter or drier, they may not have worked very well over the longer term, and so we had to go back and adjust them. And we needed to be able to demonstrate after 5 years that we had done everything within our power to go back and alter course where we could and have defensible grounds as to why we might not choose to expend any more time or effort on resolving any particular issue. Ultimately, your final report back to the regulator in these cases has to be able to show where you were and weren't successful, and if you weren't successful, why that was, and what kind of plans you might have going forward to address that. And I'll come back to that here shortly. It took 2 years to, we learned some other things too. I don't know if you know this or not, but a decision was made to open cut the majority of the wetlands on this project rather than to directional bore them. Enbridge was not sure how well that was going to work, but in fact what we found having gone through this process and revisiting a lot of those wetlands where we had issues was that after 2 years they were actually very well reclaimed. They were pretty robust, and for the most part those few wetlands where we still had issues, it wasn't the mitigation that was applied by Enbridge that failed, it was a change in land use. If the area was a little bit drier, often the farmers would go and cultivate through those wetlands, or they might let cattle in there, or whatever the case may be, but the open cut worked very well. And so that's a lesson that we've been able to take from that and can apply to future projects, whether it's a new pipeline or integrity work or replacement programs, or whatever the case may be. Open cut in most of these cases is a viable option, and you can expect to see successful reclamation within about 2 years, depending on the particular location. We also found that the majority of the construction-related issues on the project had actually been appropriately identified within the first 2 years after the in-service date. We didn't find too many issues that came up later in the project, as it turned out, that were related to construction. So what we actually found was that after the first 2 years, a lot of those new issues that were being identified by people involved in the program and being added to the list, they weren't related to construction. So maintaining a focus on what is or isn't a construction-related issue, and you still have to manage the other issues. You still have to revegetate something, you still have to manage the weeds, even if they're not caused by your construction. But we did find that, in fact, you can expect to see the majority of the construction-related issues properly identified within the first 2 years. The trick is to make sure that you're focused on that the whole time, so that you are fairly clear at the end of that period of time that you've got them all. And you should apply some kind of a similar process to all new issues when they come up, just to make sure that you're not having an incremental creep on your issues list that isn't related to actual construction problems. Having done so, what that meant was that we were actually able to, having separated those two lists, we were able to focus the resources that we had available from that program to deal with construction-related issues on those construction-related issues, whereas up until this point in time what we were finding was that increasingly we were diluting those resources to deal with other issues that weren't specific to construction. We had other resources that we could bring to bear on that, especially when operations took over the final stages of post-construction environmental monitoring and reclamation, that we could bring to bear on that. So it does allow you to be very focused with the resources that you had in place based on your initial estimates as to what it was going to take to complete the project successfully. You don't want to waste those on dealing with other issues if you don't have to. We think that essentially when you finish a large right-of-way project, or any project where you've had a large impact on green belt or lands that were previously undisturbed, you should make sure at that point in time when your project comes into service and you are looking at what issues you have to deal with as a result of your construction activities, that you document those extremely well. You should go back and compare those to the information that you had when you designed the project. Go back and make sure that, for example, if you knew that there was a weed problem at a particular location, you're going to expect to have weeds when you actually come back and spread that topsoil back down and try and reclaim that soil. Be very careful that you don't show that as being a construction-related issue. It's not. On the other hand, if you didn't have a weed problem there at the time of construction and now you do, you can assume pretty safely that that was caused by construction. It might be weed material that you brought in from off-site or imported as part of topsoil if you brought soil in, but that's one that you're going to have to monitor and deal with as part of your post-construction environmental monitoring program. And depending on your regulator's expectations, in this case the NAB was focused on one kind of issue and not the other, don't mix them up. Make sure your project looks as good as it can. Don't forget about the non-construction related issues, but you can manage those in a different fashion that isn't required to be reported on publicly in this particular case. And at the end of the day, you can then, again, say successfully, we've resolved all these issues over here. Here's the few remaining ones that are still outstanding. Here's what we've done to date on those, and here's what our plans are for going forward in the future, so that you're not leaving them with the idea that we finished our 5 years, we're done, we're out of here. Yeah, there's a few issues left over. Make sure that you've got something in place that says, yeah, we're not going to just drop the ball now. That doesn't fly too well with the regulator. And the more information you show that you've got plans for those, then the more successful you're going to be resolving your outstanding commitment for monitoring and reporting. I mentioned earlier that as you identify the new issues, go through that process, looking at what you've got for desktop information. Now you're probably going to have access to a lot of information that's stored in some kind of electronic system. Hopefully has photographs, video, reports, or whatever the case may be. I would encourage you to take advantage of those early on, build them in, and build them in knowing that someone's going to have to come back and look at those. So the fact that they're all there somewhere doesn't really help someone who hasn't got a way to actually go and look at those, pull the ones out that are relevant, and use them in conjunction with new information to actually review the issues that you have on a project and determine what kind of an issue is it and how are we going to manage it going forward. I mentioned earlier that there were close to 700 issues on the list when I got involved in 2012. At the end of that summer season, between calls from landowners, site inspections by our environmental inspectors, and we still had a couple of them on the job at this point in time, and information brought to us by our third-party consultant. And I should mention too that we could back up our position on these because it wasn't just us coming to NAB. We actually had a third-party consultant who was monitoring the status of the right-of-way, and they were able to provide that counterpoint to ourselves. If we disagreed on something, we could take a look at that and again show the NAB that we had someone else looking at it as well with a cold eye, so that we were coming forward with the best information. We were almost at the point where we were going to be adding 400 more issues to our environmental issues list at the end of 2012. That would have put us back up to almost 1,000 issues, which is essentially about where they were at, give or take a dozen or so, on the list that they had when they finished construction. So that's not the direction you want to be going. It's one thing to put a program in place. You have to keep an eye on what is your key objective. and you have to be militant about keeping that focus, and you have to have a system in place that allows you to maintain that focus and provide sound information, sound resources to assist you with making those decisions. They have to be defensible, especially when what you're reporting on is a public document when you submit the report. So if anyone had ever questioned us on the decisions we made, we could pull all that information out and say, here it is. Today, it's far easier to do that if you build systems and resources for documenting, storing, and retrieving that information in such a way that you can use it 3 or 4 years down the road from now. This was one of the biggest pipeline projects in recent Canadian history when it was built. We certainly learned an awful lot from this exercise, but it wasn't something that had been done in an awful long time. There are certainly newer projects now, and many of you here today are involved with consulting companies and other industry groups here as well that have more information, more resources at your fingertips today to assist with a well-rounded, well-designed post-construction environmental monitoring program, whether it's being regulated by a provincial regulator or a federal regulator. Don't just think about the design and execution of your project. Think about that longer-term commitment, whatever that might be, whether it's 2, 3, or 5 years, and assume that someone's going to need to be able to get back at that information 5 years down the road, if for no other reason than to be able to say, yeah, we've gone and looked at everything and we've been successful in dealing with these issues. Someone's going to have to go back and look at it. So plan for that. Don't just think about my job's done when I hit my in-service date and walk away from it, because some poor guy like me is going to come along and be stuck with trying to demonstrate to the regulator that, well, yeah, I know we keep adding another 100, 200 issues to the list every year, but I don't think they're related to construction. It doesn't fly. We were lucky to have a couple of NEB guys that came out and spent 2 weeks with us in the field, looked at dozens of sites, caused me hours and weeks and months of work on IRs when I was done. But at the end of the day, basically they agreed, yes, the focus is impacts related to construction. Have you identified them all? Have you mitigated those? Hopefully your mitigation measures applied during construction work, but if not, what have you done since then? Because you are not going to get to walk away from those after 5 years. And it was mentioned in the introduction that I came from government. For 22 years, among other things, I looked after industrial and commercial land use in and around parks across the province. And although we didn't find out in this case what the NEB might do, I know what I certainly did to companies that hadn't complied with their requirements for post-construction environmental monitoring. I kept them coming back year after year after year. And in some cases, maybe if they'd done a better job, they might have been able to prove to me that the issues that were sitting there on the ground were not necessarily caused by their construction, but they're the ones who were required to monitor and document those. Your regulator doesn't have those resources. So they're not inclined to give you the benefit of the doubt. You have to be able to show them explicitly that you're very aware of what was on the ground when you started, you know what was on the ground when you finished your project, and you have completed your requirements in terms of addressing any impacts related to construction. So instead of adding 400 activities, or issues I should say, to the list and bring it back up to 1,000, we actually ended up at the end of 2012 with a list that was cut down, 2013, to 127 issues related to construction. That was far more manageable, and that was actually more in line with what you would kind of expect to see after 3 years of post-construction work. If you started with 1,000, you should be well along the road to having everything resolved and just a few of the problematic ones left in the last few years of your project. At the time that we submitted our final report in December of 2014 to the NEB, there were only 70 issues left on that list. And for every single one of those issues, we had documentation about the history of the issue, when it was first identified, what the status was over time, what mitigations had been applied to it, and what was in the works for the following year. For every single one of those issues, we actually had a plan going forward on how to deal with the weeds or the soil compaction issues or whatever the case may be at that point too. And certainly we got a lot of compliments from the NEB on that last report, in the sense that they were kind of expecting us just to drop the ball on them, say, hey, here it is. We've only got 70 left out of the 1,000 we started with. That's pretty good. That's what they were expecting. Giving them that list saying, yeah, we were successful, here's what we've learned, and here's plans for resolving the remaining 70, that helped us with getting approval or acceptance of that final report, and the NEB actually didn't submit a single information request on that last report. I remember the 2014 report, I was just 2 weeks away from submitting that when I got a list of 14 information requests on the previous year's report. And that seems to be consistent all the way through. So in this case, we submitted it, and all we got was a thank you very much. Very happy to get the report, and we're happy to see that you have plans in place for the remaining issues. And that was the last of it. Never heard another thing from them, other than when they came and watched my presentation with Poonam at the Right-of-Way Conference. And again, they're similarly, their point was that if you're submitting something like this again, make sure that you have plans for all your issues that aren't resolved at the end of your 5-year term, if that's what the term happens to be. So another recommendation, again, make sure you've got plans and demonstrate that you're not just saying, hey, we've looked after it, our 5 years is up, and we're out of here. Okay, and again, just finally, that focus is important. It's very hard in the 3rd year of monitoring a right-of-way project to pick out what issues are related to construction and which ones aren't. By then you will have found most of the construction related issues, but you will need a little more time and effort to go and look at the ones that are left, and certainly anything new that comes up. And be prepared to go off right away to further assess the surrounding land base and land use activities. And sometimes you might have to go quite a bit further afield than you expect just to be absolutely sure about it. In a nutshell, I guess that's what we've learned from the Alberta Clipper Project.